It's time. What's up everyone, it's Goose, and today I got a new boom arm. Today we're going to be looking at a block on the Neural Quad Cortex that probably needs an update. So Neural advertises the Quad Cortex to have a pitch shifter option. And most modelers have one, but they're usually polyphonic. According to some forum members, supposedly the Quad Cortex model is not polyphonic. So today I wanted to do a comparison between this unit and the Digitech Whammy DT. The Digitech Whammy is probably best known for being used by Tom Morello, and the DT, the version I have here, is a fusion of that pedal and the Digitech drop. And the drop is actually a really commonly used pedal. It's used by a lot of bands actually who need to have multiple tunings but don't want to bring a bunch of guitars with them. And I ended up getting the DT because of two reasons. One, when I was in the market for a drop, I actually found this for about almost the same price as it. And as far as I know, the processing of the drop portion of the Whammy DT is the same as in the Digitech drop, but you can actually go up in pitch on the Whammy versus only down on the Digitech drop. Some folks say that the drop has slightly less kind of latency compared to this when you're playing through it, but I don't really have an accurate way of measuring that. However, when we do the comparisons with the Quad Cortex pitch shift, I will be commenting on the feel. Before we move on, if you like nerdy videos about guitar gear and doing all these comparisons and whatnot, consider hitting like and subscribe. So with that out of the way, let's do a quick comparison of these pitch shifters turned on, but without any pitch changes. So you can see how they color the tone when they're just even on. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's start testing these two units. The first test we're going to do is with a whole step down, so basically going from E standard to D standard. Next, we'll shift a whole step up, basically emulating kind of putting a capo or capo, or however you say that word, onto the second fret of a guitar. And then lastly, we're going to shift as far down as the Digitech drop goes, which is 7 semitones downward. We'll be using a Friedman clean and then an EVH blue for mid gain and an EVH red for high gain. For the clean parts of the comparisons, we're going to be focused on chords. Since the Quad Cortex pitch shift is supposedly not polyphonic, you'll hear the problems that creates the most on the clean chords. However, we're going to see how that carries over to arpeggiated chords when there's distortion added onto it. And then we're also going to show just how it works with like faster single note passages, kind of like fast riffs. The guitar I'll be using is my FGN. It'll be tuned to E standard with a low B, and the pitch shift block will be the first in the virtual chain on the Quad Cortex, and then I'll be running the Whammy DT into the Quad Cortex without that pitch shift enabled. And with all that out of the way, let's start with a whole step down. All right, so with the clean tone, you can hear the quad cortex has some artifacting, especially when you're holding out like chords for a very long time. The clean tone from the Whammy DT is definitely a lot more usable. I used it a bunch with clean chords, and it is basically tracks it perfectly. There is a little coloration that it adds to it. I actually think the quad cortex, aside from the artifacts, adds less coloration, but the coloration they added isn't terrible. Just slightly less upper mids and just a slight bit more mid bass. When we get to gain tones, however, the quad cortex actually covers it up a little bit. When you're going through the notes in the chords, you actually aren't hearing that warbling anymore. And it kind of adds a slight extra grind into distortion. I'm guessing that's just how it processes it as like gain. And when we get to high gain with the fast notes, it's not too noticeable anymore. At that point, I would actually consider that usable. And compared to the Whammy DT, I think the Whammy DT actually gets flubbier. The pitch shift on the quad cortex is a little bit tighter, and the feel is about the same on both of them when I'm playing through them. However, maybe just a slight bit slower on the Whammy DT, but it's not something that I feel like affected my playing or anything. And it also could be because the quad cortex just has a little slightly tighter bass, so it's not quite as flubby and there's not as much slowness to the tone. Because there's not as much low end. All right, next, let's go a whole step up, which is basically, again, simulating if there was like a capo or capo on the second fret. I will never pronounce that word correctly. Capo. Capo? All right, so once again with the clean, you're going to hear that warbling artifact. But maybe because we're shifting the pitch upward instead of downward and there's less of those bass frequencies, I actually feel like when we get to the distorted arpeggiated notes, there's just a bit more clarity. There's just less of that artifacting and that kind of adding the grind to the distortion because we're shifting upward. And I actually think there's something to that because I feel like the warbling is a bit more bass-centric. At least to my ears, I think maybe shifting up is just helping that a little bit. Again, the Whammy does this really, really well, and I actually think shifting up in pitch is actually better sounding on the Whammy than shifting down in pitch. Could be just because the mid bass is kind of making up for going up in a pitch and it's just kind of warming the sound up. So it actually sounds pretty good. All right, so let's move on to the last test, which is 7 half steps down, which is the furthest down the Whammy can go actually in either direction. And I think this is going to be a tough one because the Whammy DT does have a little bit more mid bass to my ears. However, the low end might cause more artifacting on the quad cortex. So yeah, let's see how both of these units handle 7 semitones down. So yeah, I actually wouldn't use clean tones with either of these. And the Whammy does lack the artifacting that I think is very prominent at this point in the Quad Cortex. There's just some weird lower harmonic that I just don't find pleasant when you're shifting down that much with a clean tone with chords. However, whereas distortion was able to cover up a lot for the Quad Cortex's pitch shift, I don't think it actually does enough now with it going down that many semitones. With high gain, it starts to kind of buzz like a fuzz pedal. You can hear that, especially with that last riff. And that warble came back as the chords rang out with the second riff. The warbling almost sounds like the guitar is out of tune. And so I double checked my tuning and my intonation every single time after I tracked with that pitch shift on here. And sure enough, I was actually in tune and intonated. So that warbling effect is, at that point, in my opinion, just not really usable. And that's where the biggest advantage of the Whammy DT comes in, because even though it colors the sound and adds a little bit more of that mid bass, that addition of the mid bass I think is actually helping the pitch come through. And even when we're playing really fast riffs, I feel like the pitches were super clear on the Whammy DT. Again, with the feel, I think the Quad Cortex is just slightly more responsive in like individual note chugs, but the Whammy just sounds clearer. And it's not like the Whammy DT is slow, it's plenty usable. You just might notice it a little bit, but once you get playing, once you're kind of accustomed to it, you kind of actually stop noticing it. And I can definitely play through fast riffs on the Whammy DT without feeling like the notes were falling behind. And so in conclusion, does that mean that the pitch shift of the Quad Cortex is unusable? No. I think if you're going to be using the pitch shift as an effect with some distortion, it actually will work. So if you're playing like a spirit box style song where like in the middle of a bridge, they'll just suddenly shift down half a step or shift down a full step or something, this will just cover that for you. It's not like it's unable to do that, especially if you add distortion to cover up that kind of artifacting. And as long as you don't go too far down in semitones, I think this is actually a super useful tool, especially if you just need to grab something to go and you do need a pitch shift effect. For part of a song, I wouldn't use it for a whole song, but for maybe just a small part of a song you need that pitch shift effect, this is perfect for that. But if you have an entire song you need to play through and it involves different amounts of gain on your guitar, then yeah, you need something like the Whammy DT that can track those chords without the artifacting. And I actually made this video to kind of surface that because some people will buy a modeler, see that it has a pitch shift effect and say, well, I guess I could just use this and not have to get something like a Whammy DT or a Digitech drop. And in that case, you might get misled by it. And hopefully at some point, Neural does fix this, because I would love to be able to just use the pitch shift effect on this without having to bring a Whammy or a drop tune with me wherever I need to use the Quad Cortex. And trust me when I say having that pitch shift works super well in my Fractal FM9, and I might do a comparison between the FM9 and the Whammy DT in the future, but having that function in the FM9 on the go, not having to bring an extra unit like the Whammy DT, is actually so much more convenient, and it makes the modeler unit just feel that much more complete. The whole point of a modeler versus a full tube amp setup is that it's just convenient. And I feel like having a pitch shifter within your modeling unit that doesn't have that artifacting will actually make that convenience even more convenient. Maybe in the future, I'll compare the Fractal FM9's pitch shifter with the HX Stomp XL's pitch shifter. And so let me know in the comments if you want to see that comparison. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Later.